earlier we were learning how to solve radical equations, equations like this, 3x equals 9. And we learned that before we can solve a radical equation, we've got to isolate the radical on one side of the equal sign. This one's already isolated. And then we would use the square to solve the equation. This square allowed us to get rid of this radical. And then x equals 27. And we would use the square to get rid of the radical, right? Well, here we've got a square, and we're going to use the radical to get rid of the square. See, because the radical would be the inverse function of the square. And here, to get rid of that square, we would use a radical. Just like the square is the inverse function of the radical is the inverse function of the square. And here we use the inverse of multiplication to get rid of the 3. Here we use the inverse of square root, which is a square, or the inverse of a radical, which is the square, to get rid of the radical. Well, here we use the inverse of a square, which is the radical, to get rid of the square. So basically, what I'm saying is we're going to do the opposite of what we were doing before. Before we were putting a square, using square functions to get rid of the radical. Now we're going to use radical functions to get rid of the square. Hope that makes sense. Okay? So to get rid of the square, I'm going to square root it. But what I do to one side, I've got to do to the other, right? So since I square rooted this side, I've got to square root this side. So what's the square root of x squared? Well, the square root, the radical tells me that I've got to find the number or letter or variable that when I multiply it times itself gives me the number under the radical. Well, what's the square root of 9? 3. Why 3? Because when I multiply 3 times itself, it gives me 9. Well, what's the square root of x squared? X. Why x? Because when I multiply x times itself, I get x squared. You follow? Just like I get 9 over here. When I multiply x times itself, I get x squared. So the square root of x squared is x. So we've got x equals the square root of 81. What's the square root of 81? Well, think, what number times itself gives you 81? One way of, until you get the hang of it, one way of doing it is starting with 2's. 2 times 2 is 4. That's not the square root of 81. 3 times 3 is 9. That's not the square root of 81. 4 times 4 is 16. 5 times 5 is 25. 6 times 6 is 36. 7 times 7 is 49. 8 times 8 is 64. 9 times 9 is 81. Oh, that's the square root, 9. Because 9 times 9 equals 81. And that's my answer. Now, when you're doing square roots, your answer is always going to be positive or negative. Why? Why are you going to have two answers? A positive answer and a negative answer. Because 9 times negative 9, negative 9 times negative 9 equals a positive 81. Right? Because remember, when you're multiplying and the signs are the same, your answer is always positive. So negative 9 times negative 9 gives you 81. And a positive 9 times a positive 9 also gives you 81. So that's why your answer is positive and negative, because a negative 9 times itself gives you 81, and a positive 9 times itself gives you 81. In the problems that we were doing before with radicals, the first thing we have to do is isolate the radical, right? Get the radical by itself. So I would have to get rid of this 4. So the way I would do that is dividing by 4. Both sides, right? Because the inverse of 4 times x, the inverse operation of multiplication is division. So that would get rid of the 4. And I would divide this side by 4. And all I would have is x left. And 8 divided by 4 is 2. Then to get rid of the radical, I would use the inverse of the square root function, and the inverse of the square root function is the square function. So I would square both sides, and I would get x equals 4. Okay. So my point is this, that my first step was to isolate the radical. Well, it's the same thing here. The first step is to isolate the x squared. I want to get x squared by itself. So I've got to get rid of that 4. The way I'm going to get rid of this 4 is by dividing, because this is 4 times x squared, and the inverse operation of multiplication is division, so I'm going to divide. What I do to one side, I've got to do the other. So this cancels out. It equals 1. 1 times x squared gives me x squared. 36 divided by 4 is 9. Okay, so x squared equals 9. Now, this is where I'm at now is the equivalent of this step in the radical. See where I'm at here? So here with the radical, I square it. Well, with the square, I do the opposite. I square root it. I square root both sides. See, to get rid of the square root, I squared it on both sides when I was doing radicals. Well, here I square root both sides to get rid of the square. So the square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 9 is 3. And that's my answer. X equals 3, and over here x was equal to 4. So these functions here, these equations, are related. I hope you make the connection as to how they're related. Oh no, fraction! Okay, this shouldn't scare you. Fractions should not be that hard anymore for you, hopefully, because you've been working with them for the past like 6 books or whatever, so you should be okay with fractions. Again, I've got to isolate the variable. I've got to get the x squared by itself. That's my first step. The way I'm going to get rid of the 1 over 4, well, this is 1 over 4 times x squared. Well, what's the inverse operation of multiplication? Division. So I'm going to have 1 over 4 divided by 1 over 4 to get rid of this 1 over 4. Because remember, use the inverse. X squared equals 1 over 4 times 4. Why? Because I'm sorry, not times. Divided by 4. Divided by 1 over 4. So 4 divided by 1 over 4. Why? Because I divided this side by 1 over 4, so I have to divide this side by 1 over 4 to keep the equal sign true. Okay, now let's work this out. Remember, when you're dividing fractions, you change the division sign to a multiplication sign, and you flip the fraction. Okay, so 1 over 4, I'm going to change this to multiplication, and then I'm going to flip the fraction, 4 over 1. What's going to happen here is that these 4s are going to cancel out, cross-canceling. Remember, multiplication, cross-canceling? And these 1s are going to cancel out. And what I'm going to have left is just x squared. Okay. Now here, I'm going to do the same thing. 4, I'm going to change this to multiplication, and I'm going to flip this fraction. I'm going to have 4 over 1. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 over 1 is 16. Okay, now to get rid of the square, I'm going to use the square root function, which is the inverse of the square function. So I'm going to use the square root function. The square root of x squared is x. And what's the square root of 16? Well, if you don't know, start multiplying by 2's. 2 times 2 is 4. 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 4 is 16. So the square root of 16 is 4, because 4 times itself equals 16.